Okay, so I'd like to welcome Kim, who's going to speak about EDI in the world of publishing. Thank you very much, Kim.
Thanks, James, and I hope you feel better soon. Hi, everyone. Thank you, UKRIO, for inviting me. It's an absolute privilege to be here. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Always the first test of a good presenter. Can they use the technology? So I'm hoping you can see my screen and not my notes. Yes, if you can see my notes, then you just get a fascinating insight into my script writing skills. So my name is Kim Eggleton. I'm the Research Integrity and Inclusion Manager at IOP Publishing. IOP is the Institute of Physics. So as you guessed, we publish physics stuff. We mostly publish journals, but we do have a small books portfolio as well. And we also publish some conference proceedings. While the Institute itself is based in the UK, our publishing spans the globe. So we publish researchers from all over the world. We use people from all over the world for our reviewing on editorial boards and so on. So we really think of ourselves as a global company. And while the Institute itself is not for profit, we are the commercial arm of the Institute. So any of the money that we make as a company is always gift aided back to the Institute to use for their mission to really drive physics forwards for the benefit of wider society. So what I'll spend a bit of time talking about today is how we're addressing EDI challenges in the publishing space. And it's absolutely fair to say that this was probably us just a few years ago. For a long time, this was the attitude across the publishing industry. That good science and good scientists will rise to the top naturally. It's meritocratic. And while that's really great in theory, in reality, we're starting to understand that there are huge barriers to participation in science from a really early age as well. And I think I would hope most people in this virtual room would agree that there is an issue with diversity within academia. And what publishers are starting to realise now is that that situation for years has made us almost absolve ourselves from any responsibility. We've said that we can only publish the people that submit to us. So the fact that white middle-class men are most likely to get published with us is because, well, they're the most prevalent demographic within academia. So we're off the hook, fine, no concerns there. And actually, that's really not the case. In reality, our publications, rightly or wrongly, are inextricably linked to career progression. We know that the more you publish and which journals you publish in, the more you're deemed successful and therefore likely to win more grants, more awards and get promoted. So there is this kind of vicious cycle, and any barriers that we as publishers put in place, so this little bit here, they have a huge potential impact on people's careers. So journals and publishers have realised that we're not a passive player in this system. If we're excluding people, even unintentionally or unconsciously, it's still disadvantaging them. And that cycle of disadvantage grows every time it goes round. So what I'll spend a little bit of time on today is talking through some of the challenges that we're facing into and some of the ways that we're trying and experimenting with improving the situation to make a positive impact on inclusivity and equity. We firmly believe that these are the places to start and that diversity will follow once our space is more equitable and more inclusive and welcoming. So some of the things I'll talk through today are the challenges around collecting data, and then how that leads us to examine whether there is bias in peer review. Spoiler alert, there is. We're then going to talk a little bit about how we address some of the challenges in the research itself. So specifically talking about sex and gender reporting, and also the notion of helicopter research, which I'll explore a little bit later on. And then a couple of other things to round off. One of the initiatives that a number of publishers have put in place recently is a name change policy. And then finally, we'll end the discussion looking at open access and how that can actually be a barrier to EDI work and what some of the potential solutions to that might be. It's worth saying that as we go through this discussion today, none of what I'm presenting is a fait accompli. We don't think that we've found the solution and it's done. It's very much a journey, and there's never going to be one kind of silver bullet that addresses a lot of this. This is going to be an ongoing journey of change for more than the publishers. It requires publishers, institutions, individual researchers, funders to all work together as a cohesive group in order to really drive long-lasting, sustainable change. So starting with data, as scientists and people from a scientific background, we recognise the importance of data. We need it both to understand the problem, and we also need it to measure the impact of potential solutions. But we really need to think this data collection through incredibly careful, because this is people's very personal data. There are considerable legal issues that we need to factor in, especially when dealing with protected characteristics. So that might include ethnicity, religion, sexuality. We also need to think really carefully about how and where that data is stored and who has access to it. In the UK and the EU, certainly, Brexit we'll put to one side for a moment, we have the issue of GDPR, which is very tightly controlling this kind of data and governs, when you're allowed to collect it, where you're allowed to collect it, for how long, where it should be stored, who has access to it. There's the right to be forgotten. So we need to think very carefully about the systems and the governance of this data. And we also need to think really carefully about people's right to privacy and the fact that many people won't want to share this information, no matter how laudable our intentions. Some people just will not want to share this information. And so we always need to bear in mind that this kind of questions that we're asking here, we need to think through carefully whether these need to be mandatory questions or whether we allow people the right to opt out effectively. And that's certainly covered again by the GDPR legislation. The other thing that we need to think through very carefully is that people often like to describe themselves using certain terminology, using terms that they feel comfortable with. So we need to consider how we can accommodate that whilst making that data usable, especially when we're looking at aggregating it. If we allow everybody to self-describe, aggregating that data in a meaningful way becomes quite difficult. We also need to reassure people that this data is not going to be used in any kind of editorial decision-making way. So we really need to remind everyone that this data is only ever going to be used at an aggregate reporting level, and it's not going to be used to assess individuals' contributions in any way. So there's a lot of questions around data, and at IOP we've just started to explore this a couple of years ago, and it's worth mentioning there's a fantastic working group of publishers. I think there are about 52 publisher members now in this working group looking at data collection and how we do it responsibly, looking at the labels and the terms that we use, as well as the systems and the governance that sits behind these systems. So this is how we're doing it at IOP Publishing at the moment. We started collecting gender data in 2019, it was the very end of 2019. And then we started collecting career level data, I think it was mid-2020. And we report on this aggregated data annually. So this image you can see on the left about editorial board membership, this sits on our corporate website. So at any point across our journals, somebody can go and have a look. Well, this is what IOP Publishing's collective looks like. So you can see our editorial board membership. We have a high rate of men on our editorial boards, and we also have high representations from the USA. That's not abnormal for a global publisher, but we don't feel that that's right. We know that physics is a male-dominated profession. However, we still feel that there's room there to improve, and that we are looking to increase our female representation across our editorial boards. The geographical statistics are really interesting, because when you compare this data to our submissions, for example, you'll see that China massively outweighs the USA in terms of contributions. And just last year, we also saw China overtake the USA in terms of accepted work as well. And so seeing that the USA is still the main represented group on our editorial board suggests that there's actually quite a lot of disparity there. And we're only seeing Chinese representation at 9.6%. While it's growing year on year, we know that there's a lot of work to do there. So we also report at our journal level. So that's the image on the right that you'll see there. This sits on our journal level homepages, and anyone can go on our journal homepages and see again, it's the aggregated data for geography and gender. So where are the proportions of our accepted work coming from? And also where are our reviewer invitations going to? So who are we inviting to assess the work? And I'll talk about why that's really important in just a moment. So now we have some of this data, we can start to examine whether there might be some bias within peer review and how that bias might manifest itself. So everyone's favorite grumpy cat. This is to give the impression of a grumpy reviewer. There's an ongoing joke about reviewer 2 in publishing circles, usually the more grumpy of the two. And this slide shows some of the very obvious bias that goes on within publishing. And I'm really glad to say this is infrequent. And we work very hard along with all of the publishers to make sure that these kind of comments are never sent to authors. And we also try really hard to politely educate people when they send these kind of comments in about why these comments aren't okay and why we won't be sending them on to the authors or the people that they're about. These aren't all examples from IOP Publishing. Some of them were collected as part of wider studies, which I've included the links there to the studies that have examined things like bias in peer review or kindness in peer review. And they're well worth reading in their own right. But you can see here, we definitely have some gender bias going on, and there's also some geographical or ethnic or racial bias going on there as well. So there's very conscious bias going on, but what I'm really fascinated by is the unconscious bias that's going on in peer review. And as a scientist myself, I'm always interested in what the literature's already said on a topic. And here are some of the studies that I found really influential, looking at the demographics, not only of the authors of work and the biases that they might experience, but also the demographics of the gatekeepers of those works. So by gatekeepers, we're talking about the reviewers, the editorial board members. And it seems these studies certainly suggest that the demographics of the gatekeepers also have an impact on whether the work's likely to be accepted or not. So we see a kind of homophily effect. So we know that people from the same country as the authors are slightly more likely to recommend that work be accepted. And the same goes for gender. And there are a number of studies, like I say, that you can go and read in your own time that support those kind of notions. And we're starting to look at our own data as well and finding to an extent that those do bear out in our own data. We're pleased to see that there's not a huge difference from a gender perspective. We don't see a massive difference in acceptance rates, and we certainly don't see it impacted by the demographics of our reviewers, which is in one way reassuring. But then we have to remind ourselves, well, our reviewers pretty much look the same, actually. And maybe if we had a more diverse reviewer pool, we might see more of those stats coming out. And that is something that we are actively trying to change and explore with data supporting that as we go along. And one of the solutions that we are now, we've experimented with and we are now rolling out on a more cross-portfolio scale is anonymity. So for anyone that isn't aware, the most common peer review method in the physics and more broadly across STEM as well disciplines is what's known as single anonymous, or used to be known as single blind peer review. And that means that the author's identity is known to the people who are reviewing the work. So you might be looking at, a study and you can see quite clearly who contributed to that study. And what we're experimenting with at IOP is what's more common in the social sciences publishing field, known as double anonymous, or previously known as double blind. And that means that the people reviewing the work don't know who's written the work. So the author's names are taken off the manuscript. And the reason that we're experimenting with this is because the literature is starting to suggest that this might work. And we actually found when we started exploring this a few years ago, there really wasn't anything on this in publishing. We were finding examples from other fields like recruitment, or the NASA telescope time is a really, really interesting study. A number of labs and bodies that rent telescopes effectively to scientists who want to study astronomy, they are looking at making those sort of applications for telescope time anonymous. And they've seen huge improvements in the gender diversity as a result of that. And it was one of those studies that made us think, actually, maybe we need to think about this from a publishing perspective. And so we started offering double anonymous as a choice on a few of our journals, and it increased in popularity, and there was a lot of interest from other publishers as well. And we've done a lot since 2018 in trying to understand how stakeholders feel about anonymization within peer review. And we are definitely seeing in our own data and in others' data that the double anonymous method seems to be not only more popular in a perception sense, but we're also seeing that authors who go under that double anonymous system feel that they had a more fair, more quality experience. And that goes to even those people that have their work rejected. They feel it was a more fair rejection under the double anonymous system. And we're now starting to analyze our own data. And some of the trends that we're seeing, and I should say this is very, very early days in the data, but we're starting to see that women and people who identify as non-binary are more likely to submit using an anonymous method. And we're also seeing that submissions that are anonymized seem to be more likely to be accepted. And when we break that down by geography, we're seeing some really interesting results. So just to talk you through what this graph represents, this is the difference in acceptance rate by country when authors are submitting anonymously versus when authors from the same country submit with their name on the work. And you can see there's a massive difference here for researchers in Africa and the Middle East especially. And their chance of having their work accepted is more than doubling under the double anonymous method. Interestingly, it's having the opposite effect, although not to the same scale, for countries including in regions like Australasia and Eastern Europe and the UK, where we're actually seeing work is less likely to be accepted under the double anonymous method, which suggests that potentially there has been some bias going on in the past and that double anonymous might be starting to address this. But again, huge caveat here. This is very early data. This geographical data is just for 2022 to date. So it's really only 1/4 of the year, because we only started offering double anonymous across our full titles last year in 2021. What's also interesting is that we're not seeing similar results for gender. All genders seem to be seeing a similar impact in acceptance rate. There's a couple of percentage points in it, but it's really not statistically significant. But we've recently just partnered with a researcher group who've got a full-time PhD looking across our data more widely. So we're looking at doing a 3-year study. So we're looking at our data 3 years in the past and 3 years going forwards to really study the change that double anonymous can have in the publishing space and what influence that might have on any potential bias in the peer review and publishing arena. So that's some of the experiments that we're doing at IOP, looking at the publishing system. But we also have to bear in mind the work isn't perfect when it comes to us. And is there anything we can do to influence the research that's going on, not just who's getting published, but the way that we're conducting that research is being conducted as well. And there's a few statistics on this slide that I hope people will find interesting and to an extent shocking. And these statistics all really go to talk about the fact that for a long time, it's been quite traditional for white men to be the major participants in research. And in 1993, this was recognized to the extent in the US that the National Institute of Health Revitalization Act was signed into law, which called for the NIH to require that the inclusion of women and minorities are prioritized and reported in all federally funded clinical research. So that was 1993. Despite that, there's still a huge underrepresentation of gender and ethnicities in clinical research. So the public health repercussions for this are really, really serious. We can see that there are drugs being taken off the market because we didn't realize that the dosage needed to be different because of people's gender. One of the classic examples that I use when I'm explaining this to people is the fact that women are much more likely to be injured or killed in a car crash than male drivers, because crash test dummies for decades have been modeled on the male body, sorry. So the average crash test dummy was 6 foot. It was the weight and size and shape of a male body. So it didn't have breasts. It wasn't, 5'6". And for that reason, seatbelts and cars have been designed around that male frame. And that's one of the reasons we believe that female drivers are more commonly hurt and killed on the roads. And so recognizing those kind of biases that have existed within the research provides us with an opportunity to correct that and potentially retract some of the work that's been done on that in the past, that's led to some of those incorrect assumptions being made, but make sure that going forward, we're only publishing work where the results have been disaggregated and reported on fairly across for sex and gender. And there's a really interesting set of guidelines that was released a few years ago called SAGER, which we have just implemented on one of our journals, Physical Measurement. And the SAGER guidelines provide researchers and authors with a tool to standardize the sex and gender reporting in the scientific publications wherever appropriate. They're also a really useful tool for editors who might need a practical instrument to kind of evaluate the research manuscript. So they're looking at making sure if only one sex is included in the study, that's explained why, and that it's very clear in the title and the abstract of the study. That the results and the methodology is very clearly described if it was different by sex or gender. And like I say, most importantly, those results that they're presented disaggregated by sex and gender, and that the analysis should be reported regardless of positive or negative outcome. So that's a study, a trial that we've started to put on one of our journals in the last few months, and we're seeing a really nice response from the community. We've had no pushback from authors. What we've had is authors saying, wow, thank you, we hadn't considered that. We've got the data, we'll absolutely make it more clear in the manuscript. And so we're really confident that that's going to make a positive difference to the work that's being published in our journals, and hopefully the way in which that work is influencing society. So moving on now to another way in which the research itself could perhaps be conducted from a more inclusive and equitable place. We're talking now about neocolonial helicopter or parachute research, known by a lot of different terms and not widely understood. But there's a good definition here, which I've forgotten to put the source on here, apologies. This is the definition from a Nature piece that was published just a year or so ago. And it really says that where we do research matters. If you think about Darwin and his theory of evolution, when he was collecting those samples, he was going around the world collecting those samples and taking them back to his country for study, and he wasn't involving the local community in any way. Bringing it slightly more up to date, a 2003 study by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences found that 70% of articles in a random sample of publications about underdeveloped countries didn't include a co-author from the local community. And sadly, this is really common, and some publishers and journals are starting to try and mitigate these issues, including The Lancet, Global Health, PLOS, and another publisher, Cell Press, is trying to address this by encouraging authors to submit what they're calling an inclusion and diversity form. And this form is a way for authors to declare a variety of aspects related to their research, including research methodology, sample selection, and co-author profiles. Authors can then choose whether they want to include a statement to reflect this information in their article. Cell Press have had this available for just over a year, I think, and in January this year, they announced the first kind of full year of data. And they said that 26% of their authors had completed a form and 9% had gone on to include a statement with their published paper. For me, I feel a little bit disappointed by those results, but it's the first year, and I hope that as authors become more familiar with it, they will choose to submit this kind of information more regularly. What was really positive was that 48% of those who completed a form ticked to confirm that the author list of the paper included contributors from the location where the research was conducted. They either participated in the data collection, the design, the analysis, and/or the interpretation of the work. And that for me is really, really positive and reassuring. And I'm very excited to see where Cell Press goes with this. And it's something that IOP Publishing are considering putting in place as well, that authors can declare this kind of statement, this kind of inclusive and diversity statement. Whether we make it mandatory or not is still under discussion, but it's certainly something that we think we might include as an optional thing for our authors, just to increase transparency and awareness. one of the things that we're really, really proud of at IOP Publishing, and this is coming back now to talking about how we can impact things at publication stage, was the implementation of really inclusive name change policies by multiple publishers. The version of record, especially for anyone that works in research integrity, is something that we hold quite dear, and it's not something that's changed easily or lightly. When it is changed, it's always with a notice. And whenever authors asked if they could change their name, it was pretty across the board. It was a hard no, really, across the industry. But it was completely unrecognised by publishing that when a researcher changes their name for whatever reason, they're effectively having to make a decision between foregoing all their former research under the old name or having to keep their old name. And this, of course, disproportionately affected women who most commonly change their name as a result of marriage or divorce, as well as authors transitioning their gender or changing religion. And it wasn't until a group of transgender activists took to Twitter a couple of years ago to voice the harm that it was causing them that the publishing community really stood up and started to take notice. And thanks to these activists who took the time and made themselves incredibly vulnerable to share their own personal stories, it's now more common than not for publishers to allow authors to change their name on previously published work. Authors can now write to us completely through an organised, systematic form to tell us this is the change that needs to be made. They don't have to provide supporting information, and we will make that change without any kind of notice. So we're not outing anybody without their permission. And it's made such a difference. We've made multiple changes since we put this policy in place. I think it was April last year. And we know how much it means to people to be able to finally associate their true selves with their scholarly work. So this is one of the changes we've made. And the very final point, I could talk for England, so apologies if I'm running over time. The final point I wanted to touch on, which we could probably talk for an hour just on this, is that open access, especially the move to paid open access known as gold open access, is now we're recognising that actually this might be a barrier to EDI initiatives. We know, and there was a study published really recently, that open access articles, open access journals have lower geographical diversity amongst their authors than traditional journals that have articles that kind of sit behind a paywall. What publishers have tried to do to mitigate this is often offer waivers and discounts, and these are really helpful. But most publishers, and IOP Publishing is included in this, we offer waivers and discounts based on the World Bank system. And a lot of publishers will only offer discounts to countries that are classed as low income. And that leaves a lot of researchers in what we would class as middle income countries. So Brazil is the example that I'm going to talk you through in a moment on the right, in a really difficult position. So an APC price might range anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000, depending on the publisher and the journal that you want to get published in. In Brazil, the average postdoctoral fellow salary is just $800 a month. So unless they have funding that covers publication fees, that's going to be incredibly difficult for that person to publish in an open access journal. And so what we're finding is authors in some countries are feeling priced out of publication, and they're having to publish in outlets where their work's going to be put behind a paywall. Whereas initiatives like Plan S come along and they're pushing publishers to make all their journals open access, it puts us in a really difficult position, because we don't want to create this two-tier system whereby only those who can afford to will have their research published and read, by a more global audience. And we then have other countries who are able to read lots of research but can't afford to publish in the journals that they're reading. IOP, we're trying to address this as best we can whilst complying with some of the mandates that funders are putting in place. We now offer a full 100% waivers for authors from low income countries, and we offer a 50% discount for authors from low to middle income countries. We've also recognised we need to do a lot more promotion of these schemes, because if authors don't know about it, they're never going to submit to us. And we've also recently put in place automatic screening for authors. So if they are eligible for a waiver based on the World Bank status of their country, it will be automatically applied. No author needs to ask. They don't need the humility, or it's been described as, as shame from some authors, having to ask for a discount because of the status of their economy. So by no means fixed in any way. There's a huge amount of work needed to understand how we can make open access work without disadvantaging, particularly from a geographic point of view, disadvantaging huge groups of research communities. So like I said, I could talk for England. Hopefully this has been, again, a whistle-stop tour for you of some of the issues and challenges that we're dealing with from a publishing perspective. You can read more about our work on inclusivity at the link on this slide. You can also contact me, there's my email address, and I'm on Twitter reasonably frequently, so feel free to direct message me or just tweet me publicly. I'm always happy to engage with people on this kind of stuff. And hopefully we've got a little bit of time for questions. So I will stop sharing my slide. We certainly do have time for questions.
We already have
Thank you, James.
Kim, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. And I didn't think you talked too much. It was really interesting to hear what you had to say. The first question, the question will be interested to hear your thoughts on the use of citation metrics. They can be seen as indicators of quality partly due to the volume, but of course there's been research showing that women and people with non-Western sounding surnames are far less likely to be cited.
Yeah, 100%. I'm not a massive fan of citation as the only measure of impact or quality. I'm pleased to say that there's a lot of initiatives coming to address that. However, it is still the prevailing wisdom that seems to exist across institutions globally, perhaps more strongly in some parts of the world than others, but still it seems to be the case that, you know, impact factors and citation metrics are the be all and end all. And I know, because I work in research integrity as well, when people don't get published where they want to get published, it can be very, very upsetting, and it can be really detrimental to people's careers. So I'd like to think that there are lots of other ways we can measure work, not just based on where and who's citing it. And you're absolutely right. There's studies that show that women are less likely to be cited, and that people, like you say, with ethnic sounding names, for want of a better way to describe it, non-Anglo names are also less likely to be cited. And actually the Cell Press statement, the inclusivity and diversity statement that Cell Press have rolled out, actually have a section that encourages authors to think about the diversity of their reference list. Has, you know, an equal proportion of genders been cited in the reference list, and if not, why not? And I think little initiatives like that go a long way to just making people ask those questions of themselves. I think we'd be going too far to kind of mandate, unless you've cited X proportion of people from a background, you know, you're not going to get published. It's really about awareness raising and encouraging people to be slightly more self-critical and query their own potential biases. And it's worth saying that the vast majority of biases are unconscious. People don't realize they're doing this. I have my own biases. You know, I'm human, I'm not a computer, we all have them. The key to addressing a lot of this is recognizing that you have them and trying to put in place strategies to address those biases and counteract them in some way.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I think the prompt for saying people, you know, who are the authors you're citing in your reference list is a very good one. Also ties into something that Polly said earlier that you covered, which is this is also about improving research quality, because I know so many researchers give us everything. Well, these are the people or groups that I cite in relation to this topic, because there's so much research out there. You often think, well, I need to cite people in relation to this, and these are the ones that I'm aware of, and therefore you tend to go back to them. So there's a, you know, as well as the diversity issue, which is important to address, also prompts greater examination of, well, just am I citing, you know, a limited, what are the reasons behind me citing this limited scope of sources compared to all the researchers out there? Absolutely. Thank you. We had two comments about the system of double anonymous or double blinded peer review. I think this shows, they're both from Andrew and Ava, I think this shows how it's been the norm in some sections of some disciplines of research and is quite new to others, because Ava, who's a social scientist, said that she's surprised as she can't recall any time when she peer reviewed or submitted an article where double anonymous peer reviewing wasn't in place. Whereas Andrew, and there's no criticism of Andrew, I'm sure you're from, is that, you know, the question comes from slightly newer to him. He said one criticism he's heard, it's too easy for reviewers to figure out who wrote a paper, for example, looking at who authored prior work cited in the manuscript. So Is this something that you found like people can kind of work around the double blinding, or is there a solution to it that you can suggest?
The solution, I think, is trusting people. I'll talk about that more in a minute. You're absolutely right, Andrew, and that is one of the main sort of arguments against double anonymous that we've faced into as we've tried to transition our journals over. And so we've actually tried to test out this theory. Do reviewers have a decent chance at guessing who the reviewers might be, and vice versa? Can the reviewers guess who the authors are? And so we've actually started asking the reviewers, if the manuscript was anonymized, how confident would you feel taking a guess at the author's identity? And they give us an answer, and then if they feel confident, they can actually put in their guess. This is all through a survey that we do post-submission, post-acceptance. And our results at the moment show that 85% of reviewers are either incorrectly guessing or are not confident in making a guess at all.
Very interesting.
Which I'm really reassured by, because the prevailing wisdom that I kept getting told was that I know everyone in this field. I know who's working on what. I'll be able to tell from the writing style. This isn't going to work. And actually, when you put people in the situation and said, okay, put your money where your mouth is, tell me who wrote this manuscript, it's a bit more, I'm not completely sure. We're sharing that data again with the researchers that we're working with, and hope to produce some data that we would like to get published at some point, to try and sort of dispel that myth. That
Really
it's a closed network.
I think there's plenty of anecdotes about people either being able to get past double blind or not get past. A colleague who works in a double blinded discipline regularly gets told that she clearly hasn't read research by herself.
Yeah.
I think evidence where there's anecdotes is a really powerful tool, so thank you for that. That's good to find out more about that. A question: is it correct to call open access a barrier when the Directory of Open Access Journals indexes over 12,000 open access journals that are free to authors and readers?
It's not completely a barrier, far from it. Open access is a wonderful thing in terms of the dissemination of knowledge. It's removing a barrier, so it's phenomenal in that sense. What I mean is it's a potential barrier to publication, especially the gold open access method where there's a pay to publish element. It obviously depends what the fee is, but what we have to remember is that publishers have been charging subscription rates for years, and they've been altering those subscription rates a lot of the time based on geography. So some countries have paid at a lower rate than other countries, depending on national income and that kind of thing. And to an extent, we don't see that being applied in APCs, although it is changing. And what we run the risk of is pricing some authors out of the gold open access journals by having extortionate APCs that are not affordable under their situation. And so journals need to work out, and I don't have the answer, far from it, but I think we just need to be really mindful of it before we all rush into this brave gold open access world. We cannot, at our peril, do we forget the implications for ED&I. And like I say, some publishers are trying to address it through waivers and discounts. There's the platinum open access model, whereby journals are sponsored sort of by an organization. There's, transformative agreements is a really interesting way of addressing this issue. But I don't think anyone's kind of hit on the one solution. There may not be one solution. It may be a myriad of solutions. But yeah, at our peril, do we forget the implications that move to gold open access has on EDI?
Yeah, thank you. Paul has a related question and asks, could the waiver be based on the person's income, noting that he's on a pension and therefore that kind of means he couldn't pay any fees?
That's a really, really good point, Paul. And in my knowledge, I'm not aware of any publishers that have a stated policy on that. The majority of publishers, however, do offer waivers based on discretion, which isn't very widely known or advertised. But I know, at IOP, we'll quite often get people writing to us saying, I can't afford this fee. Is there anything you can do to help? And we'll try and find a way to make it work for them. We can't waive everybody's fee, but where situations we think warrant that waiving, then we will do it. But that's an interesting point, Paul, that I will take back to the open access team at IOP, and just to see if anybody's aware of any initiatives in that area, and I'll feed it back to James if I hear of anything.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Anonymous attendee asked if we need to think carefully about privacy and whether questions should be optional. Why is I identify my gender as a required question?
Excellent question, and you're absolutely right. In a sense, it's an optional question. So the way we deal with it at IOP is it's a compulsory question, but as in the drop-down menu, there is a prefer not to answer. So it's mandatory, but it's optional, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the reason we do that is we want as many people as possible to fill out the question, but we're absolutely mindful of people's privacy, and we do not insist, that anybody picks any of the genders. They're very welcome to pick prefer not to say. And we see, I think it's about 2.6% of people opting not to declare their gender, which is lower than I expected. But absolutely no qualms about that. It's people's private information. They don't have to tell us at all.
Thank you. Jessica asks, how are you intending to increase the diversity of your reviewer pool?
Great question, Jessica. It's absolutely something we need to do. We know that our reviewers are often selected from more Western countries. Reviewers with more Anglo-sounding names are more likely to be selected. We don't see a huge disparity in gender. There is a little one with males being favoured, but it's not as striking as the geographical difference. What we've tried to do is we've actually experimented on a couple of our journals with some different methods. We have started applying sort of a targeted group flag, for want of a better word. So when our editorial team are looking for reviewers, they'll see some names will have a little flag by them. And that doesn't mean they're particularly, in any specific country or any specific gender. It just means that they're from an underrepresented group. And that visual cue definitely seems to help our editorial team be more likely to select those people for review. The other tool that we're trying to use is free peer review training, which we offer both in institutions through webinars and online. People can do e-learning on their own, and we're really trying to target those to our underrepresented groups. So specifically targeting them to Asian African countries, to try and improve the number of reviewers from those countries within our database for us to select from. And helping those people, become the best reviewers that they can be, and that again seems to make a really big difference. But it's work in progress.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I think we'll stop the questions there. We have a few that we haven't been able to answer, but we'll see how we can follow up other means. And in closing the webinar, I'd like to firstly thank our excellent speakers today, Kim and Polly, for their very informative talks and lively discussion sessions afterwards. It's been a really productive and informative session today. I've certainly learned a lot, and UK Real will be doing more work on EDI in the coming months. For example, we have a speaker on EDI from a university background talking about work at her institution at our annual conference, which is free to attend. Booking links are open, and it's on the 25th and 26th of May, so please do come along if you can. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speakers, Polly and Kim, for their excellent webinar, the UK Rio staff behind the scenes who made this happen, and you, the audience, who made this a really interesting and lively conversation about such an important issue. Thank you very much. As I said, we have our annual conference coming up. Booking links are on our website and social media, and the colleague may be about the booking link in the chat. Please do come along. We'll be doing further webinars later this year. The next one is July, and there'll be 2 or 3 webinars after that running off the calendar for 2022. It seems very odd to be talking about the end of the year, but that's what we're planning for you. We're also doing virtual roundtables for representatives of the institutions that subscribe to UK Rio, currently called out to support research integrity. So we're sending out invitations to those. If you'd like to participate and haven't been invited yet, please do drop us a line. Finally, if this event today has gotten you fired up about issues of research integrity and EDI and good practice. UK Rio is a charity supported by a lot of volunteers, and we're always looking for people with a passion for good research ethics, research quality, and a healthy research and inclusive research culture. So if you'd be interested in volunteering with the charity and like to find out more about what that involves, please do get in contact with us via our website. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been great to see you here today. A final thank you to Kim and Polly for their excellent talks, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you all very much.